Good evening and welcome. Glad you can join us. This is our Wednesday evening, 6 p.m. Bible study period. We're studying from a book of lessons by Brother Gene Taylor called Prophecy and the Prophets. We're studying this so that we'll have a better grasp of what prophets and prophecy is all about. Starting back in the Old Testament, prophets are those who speak for God, those who speak on God's behalf. We've covered quite a lot of territory so far, and this evening we'll be studying from the book of Daniel. Daniel, of course, is a prophet that's pretty well known. Many people know something of the things that happened in the book of Daniel. Some of the familiar stories, like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego at the fiery furnace, and Daniel in the lion's den. Many are familiar with the great images and visions that Daniel saw, the great kingdoms of the earth represented by a great image that he saw, the images of the lion and the bear and the eagle and all those, and the prophecies that Daniel brings up, the prophecy of the 70 weeks, and all of these we'll talk about as we get into our study here. The book of Daniel is one which, of course, is written in a time period that's important. We need to take a bit of time to set where this thing takes place, what kind of setting the book of Daniel is found in, And because of that, we need to illustrate some things to begin with about this book. Now, the name Daniel is kind of significant. The Daniel has at the end of it that EL suffix, which refers to God. And in this case, the book is named God is my judge. That's what Daniel's name means. And throughout the book that he writes, he does refer back to God as being his judge, his regulator, the one who rules in his life. And that's an important concept that we'll see throughout the book of Daniel as we study it. We also know that Daniel was a little different than some of the other prophets. We've talked about prophets going back to the oral prophets, Elijah and Elisha. We've talked about written prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. And those prophets spoke directly to the people. They were of different classes of people themselves, but most of the time their message was directed toward the individuals making up the people of Israel or Judah. We get to Daniel, and Daniel is from a little bit different background. Daniel is a prince, actually. He's from a noble family. We turn back to the first chapter of the book of Daniel, and in verse 3, he writes, Then the king instructed, that's Jehoiakim, instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles. That's the group that Daniel was associated with. As he writes this, he puts himself in with that group, the king's descendants and some of the nobles. Down in verse 6 of that chapter, we're told here about the ones who were taken in the first wave of captives that the Babylonians took back to their land. And verse 6 tells us, Now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. We know those last three later on as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. But Daniel was from this family of princes, and you can kind of see the reasoning of the Babylonians. We've been kind of driving toward here the captivity of Judah, and Daniel prophesies entirely within that period of captivity. So as he is a captive himself, he's not like just all the other people that were taken to Babylon. He is elevated somewhat to a position of leadership, to a position of being an advisor to the king in many cases. But because of this, his message is a little bit different, and we'll be talking about that as we go into the study of the book itself. Daniel was taken fairly young. Most authorities think he was maybe 15 or 16 years old when he was taken to Babylon in this first group of captives. He does say in his writing here that it is the third year of Jehoiakim. So Jehoiakim was not the last of the, quote, kings of Judah, but he was in that last span of evil kings that brought about the final captivity. But at the time Daniel was taken captive, Judah still existed. The temple was still in place. Jerusalem had not been destroyed. But Nebuchadnezzar was already taking some of the choicest people from Judah and carrying them off to Babylon. So Daniel was in that group. In fact, when Daniel gets to Babylon, he is given a special name. His name is changed to a Chaldean name, which is Belteshazzar. Belteshazzar became his Chaldean. The Chaldeans and the Babylonians are the same people. The Chaldeans is like the cultural name for them, and the Babylonians is more of the governmental unit that they belong to, the territorial name. Uh, but here, Daniel is not just assimilated into the culture. He's given the best of the culture. He's given this name, Belteshazzar, as we'll see a bit later on, is a name that is sort of connected with kings. There's a king, Belshazzar, which we'll read about. But Belteshazzar is a kingly name, and then also he's instructed in the wisdom and the science of the Chaldeans. They were way ahead of their time as far as knowledge and wisdom. They were pretty skilled in things like astronomy. They knew about the stars. They were skilled in some aspects of science as we would know it, physics and biology and chemistry. They knew some things. But Daniel was special in their eyes. He was one who was very able and quite adept at taking in their teachings. So Daniel was instructed in this Chaldean wisdom along with the other young men of the Chaldeans. If you take your course book where we're studying from, we're studying lesson 12 on Daniel, and right now we're on page 40 in the course book. Page 40 continues to give us more about Daniel's personal life. If you look up toward the top of the page there, in point number 3, we're given some more facts about his personal life while he was a captive there in Babylon. One of the things we figure is that all of this instruction he was receiving was for the purpose of becoming prepared for royal service. Nebuchadnezzar had identified those that would be valuable to him in his kingdom. Daniel was one of them. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were others. But these young men were trained. They were being groomed, if you will, for service in Nebuchadnezzar's kingdom. And during that time, there was a conflict that came up in the very first chapter. Remember, you've studied this before, but Daniel was he and the other young men from Judah were being told to eat the king's meal, eat the delicacies and drink the fine wines of the king. And some of that was against the teaching of the law of Moses. And so Daniel and his friends opted to eat only vegetables. They worked out a deal where they would be tested to see if just vegetables and their kind of food would be appropriate for them. And it turned out that it was. Daniel worked this into his benefit because of being able to eat the things that he was used to and that he knew would be good for him. It made him even better prepared to be a student of his Babylonian instructors. The counterparts in the Babylonian government maybe were held back some by their indulgence in all the king's finery. But Daniel and his companions did not. So we learn later on that they were elevated to some pretty high positions in the Babylonian government and in the kingdom. Daniel also, in this time of beginning here, had a very strong personal commitment to God. That's one of the markers of his personal life. He remained devoted to God even though he was taken from his homeland. A lot of times being uprooted from your homeland is a sure way to destroy your religious foundations. But in Daniel's case and in the case of the others like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, we find that they remained devoted to God. Daniel was also a very interesting individual himself. He had great ability. He's one of those students that teachers like to have. He had good understanding. He had the ability to grasp the things that he was being taught, and he really impressed his captors and his teachers with this ability that he had. But that wasn't all. In Daniel's case, he also had the assistance of God. God gave to Daniel these gifts of being able to explain mysteries, being able to explain the unexplainable, and the interpreting of dreams. Daniel, through God's help, was able to interpret the dreams of Nebuchadnezzar and to explain some things that were seen by other rulers, and even to bring forth visions of his own that God had given him that detailed what was going to happen later in the future. And so God gave Daniel these gifts in which he was able to interpret dreams, and he did a couple for Nebuchadnezzar. If you remember in chapter 2, uh, there was this dream that Nebuchadnezzar has, which at first he wouldn't reveal. He wanted his own advisors, his astrologers and sorcerers and so on, to come and tell him the dream and then interpret it for him. And that just ripped them to shreds. They couldn't do it. They said, "How can we tell you what you dreamed?" And he says, "Well, if you're any good, you can." They weren't. And so they were about to all be destroyed until the decree went out, and Daniel shows up at the scene. Daniel says to the king, "Don't destroy all these astrologers and everyone." He says, "With God's help, I can help you." And later there in chapter 2, Daniel makes this statement in verse 28. 27 and 28, answered in the presence of the king and said, "The secret which the king has demanded, the wise men, the astrologers, the magicians, and the soothsayers cannot declare to the king. But there is a God in heaven who reveals secrets, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the later days. Your dream and the visions of your head upon your bed were these." And so Daniel says, "I can tell you what you dreamed, but it's God that's giving me this information. And the reason for it is prophecy. It's for the future that you'll see these things." And he goes on to tell Nebuchadnezzar about this great image that he dreamed about, an image who's had a head of fine gold, a chest and arms of silver, its belly and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, and its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And we'll talk about that image more in detail, but the basic revealing of it was that this image represented the kingdoms that were to come in the future in the exact order in which they would appear. It even brings in the kingdom of the Lord, when at the end of it a stone which was cut out without hands strikes the image and it breaks it in pieces. And so he brings up too that image is one that will come from God. That is the final kingdom. That is the kingdom of God, which will be never destroyed. Anyway, that's a good one to remember. We'll come back to that. Over in the 4th chapter, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed this dream. He was talking. It was a dream about a tree in the midst of all the earth, and he was wondering what this vision meant. Daniel comes along and he's able to declare it to him. Daniel does so in such a way that Nebuchadnezzar would understand the meaning of it, that his kingdom would be coming to an end, that there'd be others who would take over after him. And again, Nebuchadnezzar recognized the great power of God, and he declares it. He even goes on to say that the blessed and high God who has revealed this, he says, no one should speak against him, and all inhabitants of the earth should listen to this great God. But the idea here that God allowed Daniel the tools to explain these mysteries and interpret these dreams is a very important thing in Daniel's life that we can make use of. We recognize that God does not do that type of thing today, but working with his prophets there in Daniel's time, that was a way that things were done. Daniel also progressed in his abilities. He was made ruler over Babylon, Babylon was a whole country, but there was also a province called Babylon, and that was what Daniel was set over. He was also placed over the governors of that particular province. So he not only took charge of the whole province, but he took charge of those original Chaldeans and Babylonians who were there trying to run the country. Back in chapter 2 and verse 48, we're given this information about Daniel's ability. Chapter 2 and verse, then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts, and he made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief administrator over all the wise men of Babylon. So later on, we'll know that those wise men were also the governors of the provinces. Daniel earned and was given the great honor of being the governor of all, or the ruler over those. Then we look at some other points too, and one of the things that Daniel did was to give immediate response. In chapter 5, one of the stories that I remember very much about the book of Daniel is that story when the king is now Belshazzar. Belshazzar was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, uh, maybe a grandchild. We're not sure. The scripture uses the term father, but that's kind of nebulous in the Old Testament. Sometimes that just means an ancestor of that person. But we're told there in chapter 5 that Belshazzar made a great feast and not only used all the great good things of his own kingdom, but he brought the gold and the vessels from the temple, which his ancestor Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple in Jerusalem. And he did all that, which angered God greatly. And during the time of this great feast, Belshazzar sees writing on the wall. You remember that? Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Uh, and he was wondering what that meant. Nobody could tell him. The great astrologers and interpreters of his own people couldn't do it. So again, Daniel was summoned, and when Daniel tells him, he says, "This is simple. God has judged your kingdom. God has numbered your kingdom and finished it," he says. "You've been weighed in the balances and found wanting, and your kingdom will be divided and given to the Medes and the Persians." Well, that's exactly what happened. That very night of that feast, the Medes and the Persians took over. Belshazzar was slain, and Darius the Mede, or Darius the Mede, let me pronounce that right, he received the kingdom. So Daniel gave some on-the-spot interpretations as these things were developing. Well, Darius was the Mede in the Persian area. And under Darius the Mede in chapter 6, we're told that Daniel was elevated to even more positions of authority. He was one of 3 presidents that were put under Darius the Mede, and those presidents ruled over all the others. Chapter 6, the first couple of verses tell us how over these 3 governors was set up, of whom Daniel was one, and these satraps, or lower level governors, would account to them, and the king would suffer no loss. So Daniel was right up there at the very top echelon of the rulership in this kingdom. So the personal things that we know about Daniel are extremely important. We also realize how his devotion to God saved his life. Remember in chapter 6, Daniel had become a great and mighty leader among the Babylonians. Like we said there, he was set up over these other rulers, but they were actually not pleased with that, and they wanted to get rid of him. So these enemies of Daniel hatched up a plot to overthrow him, and we'll study more about it later in detail. But remember that this is where the king Darius had made this decree that if anyone prayed to another god besides the king, then he would be thrown into a den of lions. And once the Median king, Darius, signed it, it couldn't be revoked. That was one of the oddities of their government, was that once that decree was signed, it could not be revoked even by the king himself. And so Daniel knew what the king had signed, but as was his custom, he went ahead and prayed to God regularly in his house, as he'd always done. And of course, he was discovered and thrown into the den of lions. But though his enemies attempted to overthrow him and kill him by throwing him in that den of lions, even King Darius was pretty sure he would be okay. He himself believed that Daniel's God would protect him, and that's what happened. God shut the mouths of the lions. Daniel came out alive, and he was revered even more then by King Darius, and even those who accused Daniel were thrown into the lion's den with their families, and they were all eaten up. But again, what brought that about? That was because of Daniel's devotion to God and his continuing to do exactly what God said, no matter what the conditions were. Well, Daniel is a character that we can learn a lot from. And as far as we know, he continued to serve until the time of King Cyrus of Persia. See, we have the Babylonian Empire with Nebuchadnezzar, and then in the middle here is Darius the Mede. And then later on, 538 BC, King Cyrus takes over. He's strictly the Persian influence. And so now a whole new system is ushered in. But King Cyrus is the one that Isaiah had prophesied would be turning the Jews loose to go back to their homeland. And so Daniel prophesied right up until that time and stayed in Babylon after that even. But he continued to serve until King Cyrus, and later on did not go back to Judah. He was not among those who went back to the homeland. He stayed there in Judah, spent his last days in Babylon as far as we know. And that was probably very useful because some of the Jews had stayed there in Babylon as well. Remember that they weren't strictly captives in prison. They were given a pretty good free run and could engage in business and society and so on there in Babylon. And many Jews had accomplished a great deal. They didn't want to leave. They weren't interested in coming back home. So Daniel perhaps had a role to play there and spent his last days being a prophetic influence on those who stayed back in Babylon. This is interesting, too, that Daniel is one of those prophets of whom nothing evil or negative is said. Nothing in the book of Daniel, nothing in anybody else's writings mentions anything negative about Daniel. He was always stalwart and straightforward and devoted to God. In fact, in chapter 9 here in the book of Daniel, and also in chapter 10, he's referred to from heavenly sources, the angel Gabriel and some other heavenly appearances, to be greatly beloved. He was a greatly beloved man. Jesus even mentions Daniel as being a prophet, the prophet Daniel, he says. And so he was known to the Jews later on in the New Testament, and the book that he wrote, of course, was extremely important, although the Jews generally did not grasp the impact of some of his prophecies. His prophecies pointed to the coming of the Messiah in the time of the Roman Empire, and yet many of the Jews who read the book of Daniel and revered him as a prophet did not catch that point. They did not see when the Messiah was coming. So those are some pretty good points to take a look at as far as Daniel's personal situation. Let's talk for a moment about his prophetic ministry. Daniel, of course, is, like we mentioned at the beginning, he's like the other prophets. He had a mission to fulfill. His mission was twofold. One was to speak the words of God, however they were delivered to him, to the ones that were supposed to get the message, be it the Jews themselves or the rulers of these kingdoms where they were. The other was to bring about repentance. Daniel's prophecies were just like the ones that Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel prophesied. God wants his people to turn back to him. And Daniel brought that up himself. But at the same time, he was also involved in showing them the way to the future. Remember, he was prophesying to people here who were in captivity. And so his prophecies encouraged them to think about the way that things would be on down the road, much down into the future. The prophecies that Daniel gave would have given any of the Jews hope for Judah to return to its power somewhat, and also to look ahead at the coming of the Messiah. So Daniel's ministry had many different aspects to it. He served a long time, 60 plus years, from 605 BC up to 536, and he was a contemporary, remember, in that exile situation with Jeremiah and Ezekiel. Jeremiah prophesied some before the destruction of Jerusalem, and then some after, when he went to Babylon himself. Ezekiel went with that first wave of captives to Judah, to Babylon, and was a captive there as well. And like we said, those two primarily preached to the people themselves. Daniel, however, was one who represented God in the courts of the ruling nations. That was his primary job. He went before the kings. He went before those when the king had questions like interpreting dreams or the vision that Daniel had. That was for the people also, but mainly for the rulers that Daniel would go before. And so he uh, he spent his whole time there taking this little role, but mostly looking towards the rulers of the kingdom that he had messages for. So, what about the date of this writing? We're we're not always certain exactly of the dates when these things are put together, but if you take a look here, Daniel, like we said, can be located in history, not because Daniel writes anything particular about dates in here. He doesn't say, I'm writing this in 606 BC. He wouldn't have known that, but some of the things that are written give us a marker for history. For example, in the first chapter of Daniel, in the first verse, he says, in the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. Okay, well, we can go back to history and pretty closely locate when King Jehoiakim was reigning, and the third year of his reign would be around 606, 605 BC. And then when the end of Daniel's prophecy occurs, we could look at about chapter 10 there, when he describes the rule of Cyrus beginning. Cyrus, remember, was the one who would let the people return, and so the captivity effectively ends with the reign of Cyrus. And chapter 10, first verse there says, in the third year of Cyrus, king of Persia, a message was revealed to Daniel, whose name was called Belteshazzar. The message was true, but the appointed time was long, and he understood the message and had good understanding of the vision. Daniel also names himself there in chapter 10 as the author of this book. But here's what's happening. We're given these historical markers that help us place the writing of Daniel in that time period. The book covers the whole 70 years of exile, from the time that the people went to exile, Daniel going with that first group of Jewish princes and young leaders that were taken, all the way through the end of it. So his prophecy, you could say, ran that whole 70 years. The book covers that much for sure. And then we learn about the timing of the taking of these captives. That 70 years covers from the first time captives were taken, and that's recorded for us back in 2 Chronicles chapter 36, when Nebuchadnezzar comes and takes the captives from among the rulers and the leaders of Judah. And then in Daniel chapter 1, Daniel relates to us there how that the Lord, through his instructions, caused the young men of the powers that were then the leaders, the judges, and so on among Israel, that they were taken captive in that first wave that went to Babylon. And then that 70-year exile went all the way through to the time of Ezra. Remember, Ezra led the final return back to Babylon to start rebuilding the temple, start rebuilding the worship, and then later Nehemiah comes along and they rebuild the walls of the city. But that span covers those events, so we've got some pretty good historical events to date this thing. Daniel also is dated not by scriptural events too much, but it's also tied to the history of the world leaders of that time. We can go back and look at the reign of Nebuchadnezzar. That's pretty well documented in the historical documents of Babylon. Also, his grandson, Belshazzar, the next king of the Medes, Darius, and then the Persian king Cyrus, all of those left a very profound historical trail. And that trail ties together with the dates of the book of Daniel. It was likely written just before the close of the captivity, right before Daniel died. And that would have been an appropriate time because it covered that whole span of the 70 years. Well, our time's about up for this evening, and next time we're going to start looking at the setting of the book of Daniel, and also get ourselves into a little bit of the synopsis of the book, how the book is put together, and then finally take a look at the main messages of the book. So we have at least a week or two of good hard study left. Please take your course book and read on ahead. Read some of the book of Daniel. The prophecies there are not impossible to follow, and we'll be able to get to some of them in our study here. But we appreciate you for joining us for this period of study. We appreciate that all have had an opportunity to look at this together. If you have any comments or insights or questions, please do put those in our comments section there on our YouTube channel. And if you need to look at earlier Bible lessons, go to any one of them on the YouTube channel and then just click on our channel name, and it'll take you to all the videos that are posted in that channel, which are pretty much all of them we've done so far for the past 6 months or so. Do keep in mind that we have obligations to those of our brothers and sisters who have needs, and please be aware of those and keep them in your prayers. And let me or some of the men of the church know if there are things that we need to be aware of that we can help with. Again, thank you for being with us, and we look forward to seeing you again here in the book of Daniel next week. Take care. May God bless you.